It is said that the roads we walk today are merely traces of journeys taken centuries ago, pathways that carried more than footsteps. They carried ideas, beliefs, dreams, and treasures. Imagine, if you will, a vast network stretching across deserts, mountains, and rivers, linking the bustling markets of East Asia with the Mediterranean world. This was not just a route of commerce, it was a lifeline of human connection, a thread weaving together cultures separated by thousands of miles. This is the story of the Silk Road, the arteries of global trade that shaped the destinies of empires and the lives of ordinary people alike. Hello and welcome to The Other Side Stories. Here we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The origins of the Silk Road are as much about ambition as they are about necessity. In the ancient world, goods were not simply commodities, they were symbols of status, instruments of diplomacy, and carriers of cultural identity. Silk, for which the road is named, was more than a fabric. It was a metaphor for sophistication, a luxury that carried with it the aura of the distant lands from which it came. In the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, Chinese artisans perfected the delicate weaving of silk, a craft so prized that the secrets of its production were guarded zealously, punishable by death for those who dared to divulge it. Yet the allure of silk could not be contained within the borders of China. From the grand palaces of Rome to the markets of Persia, the demand for this shimmering fabric ignited a trade network that would grow to connect continents. The Silk Road was not a single road, nor was it a straight line. It was a labyrinthine network of paths that shifted with the seasons and political tides. Caravans laden with silk, spices, ceramics, and precious metals crossed arid deserts where the sun scorched the earth and the nights brought bitter cold. Camel caravans trudged through the Taklamakan Desert, sometimes called the Desert of Death, where sandstorms could erase tracks in minutes, and survival depended on preparation and knowledge passed down through generations. Yet, it was not just merchants who braved these dangers. Scholars, monks, envoys, and adventurers all traversed these routes, leaving behind the intangible cargo of ideas, religions, and philosophies. Buddhism, for instance, spread from India into Central Asia and China largely along these pathways, carried by monks whose devotion to their faith intertwined with the practicalities of trade. It is remarkable to consider that the movement of goods along the Silk Road also carried seeds of globalization centuries before the term existed. Precious stones mined in Afghanistan found their way to the palaces of Byzantium. Paper, invented in China during the Han era, traveled westward, eventually catalyzing administrative and intellectual revolutions in the Islamic world and Europe. Even culinary traditions were affected. Noodles from China inspired dishes as far west as Italy, planting the earliest seeds of what would later evolve into pasta. These exchanges were not one way. The Silk Road was a channel of mutual influence. Techniques of glassmaking, styles of jewelry, musical instruments, and even artistic motifs moved in both directions, creating a shared cultural lexicon across continents. The political landscape of the Silk Road was as complex as its geography. Empires rose and fell, and each exerted its influence over the routes that threaded through their territories. The Parthian Empire, controlling much of what is now Iran, acted as a buffer and facilitator between East and West, exacting tolls and protection for merchants in exchange for tribute. Later, the Sassanid Empire would continue this role, navigating the delicate balance between encouraging trade and guarding against the destabilizing effects of wealth entering from foreign lands. In China, the Han Dynasty invested in the protection of these trade routes, establishing garrisons and way stations to ensure the safe passage of goods and information. The famous envoy Zhang Qian's journeys westward, initially intended to forge alliances against nomadic threats, inadvertently laid the groundwork for sustained commercial relations between East and West, demonstrating the intertwined nature of diplomacy and trade. Yet, despite its grandeur and historical significance, the Silk Road was far from a seamless or universally safe passage. Banditry, political instability, and harsh environmental conditions made each journey perilous. Merchants had to rely on the guidance of seasoned caravan leaders who knew the location of water sources, the timing of seasonal winds, and the behavior of nomadic tribes, whose cooperation or hostility could determine the success of an expedition. In these travels, merchants not only exchanged goods, but also exchanged stories, knowledge of distant lands, and even disease, as the Silk Road would inadvertently facilitate the spread of epidemics as well as innovations. The movement of people and ideas along these routes made the Silk Road an early agent of both connectivity and vulnerability, shaping civilizations in ways both visible and invisible. Consider the city of Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan, a jewel of the Silk Road and a meeting point of countless cultures. Merchants from China, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean mingled in its markets, exchanging silks for spices, precious stones for glassware, and coins for textiles. But more than goods were exchanged, languages collided, religions encountered one another, and new artistic expressions emerged from this fertile cultural cross-pollination. The architectural grandeur of Samarkand, with its ornate madrasas and soaring minarets, reflects the synthesis of influences from across the Eurasian landmass, embodying the Silk Road's role not merely a conduit for commerce, but as a crucible of civilization. Maritime routes complemented the overland Silk Road, extending its reach into the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and beyond. Ships carrying spices, incense, and textiles from South and Southeast Asia reached ports in Persia, Arabia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The monsoon winds dictated the rhythm of maritime trade, linking distant civilizations in a seasonal dance of wind and wave. The integration of sea routes with overland pathways formed a complex, adaptive network, enabling goods and ideas to flow across vast distances with remarkable efficiency for the time. This illustrates an early form of globalization long before the age of steamships and telegraphs. Cultural exchange along the Silk Road went far beyond material wealth. Philosophical and religious ideas traveled alongside merchants, shaping societies in profound ways. Nestorian Christianity spread eastward into Central Asia and China, Zoroastrian practices influenced local customs along Persian-controlled routes, and Islamic thought later traversed the same paths, leaving indelible marks on art, architecture, and learning. The Silk Road also nurtured scientific exchange. Astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and agricultural techniques moved between civilizations, enriching societies and sowing the seeds for future intellectual achievements. Trade along the Silk Road was also a story of adaptation and resilience. Merchants developed innovative techniques to handle the logistical challenges posed by long journeys. Detailed accounting methods, sophisticated caravan-sarai networks, and agreements with local rulers exemplify the entrepreneurial spirit that thrived in this environment. Letters of credit and bills of exchange, precursors to modern financial instruments, emerged to facilitate transactions across vast distances, revealing an early understanding of risk management and trust in commerce. In essence, the Silk Road was not only a path of material exchange, but also a laboratory for human ingenuity, where commerce, diplomacy, and culture intertwined. The Silk Road's impact on societies along its routes cannot be overstated. In China, the influx of foreign goods and ideas prompted the development of urban centers and stimulated artistic expression. Central Asian cities flourished as commercial and cultural hubs, benefiting from both taxes and the cosmopolitan character brought by diverse populations. In the West, Roman elites' insatiable demand for Eastern luxuries influenced domestic production, trade policies, and even social norms. Beyond economics, the Silk Road shaped perceptions of the wider world, offering glimpses of distant lands and peoples and fostering curiosity, ambition, and a sense of global interconnectedness among those who might never leave their hometowns. The origins of the Silk Road are as much about ambition as they are about necessity. In the ancient world, goods were not simply commodities, they were symbols of status, instruments of diplomacy, and carriers of cultural identity. Silk, for which the road is named, was more than a fabric. It was a metaphor for sophistication, a luxury that carried with it the aura of the distant lands from which it came. In the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, Chinese artisans perfected the delicate weaving of silk, a craft so prized that the secrets of its production were guarded zealously, punishable by death for those who dared to divulge it. Yet, the allure of silk could not be contained within the borders of China. From the grand palaces of Rome to the markets of Persia, the demand for this shimmering fabric ignited a trade network that would grow to connect continents. The Silk Road was not a single road, nor was it a straight line. It was a labyrinthine network of paths that shifted with the seasons and political tides. Caravans laden with silk, spices, ceramics, and precious metals crossed arid deserts where the sun scorched the earth and the nights brought bitter cold. Camel caravans trudged through the Taklamakan Desert, sometimes called the Desert of Death, where sandstorms could erase tracks in minutes, and survival depended on preparation and knowledge passed down through generations. Yet, it was not just merchants who braved these dangers. Scholars, the Silk Road also stands as a testament to human curiosity and the desire to explore the unknown. Travelers such as Marco Polo, though arriving centuries later, were inspired by tales passed down through merchants, diplomats, and missionaries who had ventured far from their homes. These accounts, rich with descriptions of distant lands and exotic customs, fueled imaginations and encouraged further journeys. The Silk Road, in this sense, was as much a mental landscape as a physical one, a space where knowledge, myth, and observation intersected. Maps were drawn and redrawn, stories accumulated, and perceptions of the world expanded with each caravan that crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts. Religion played a profound role along the Silk Road, influencing both the movements of people and the structures of cities. Buddhist monks traveled from India through Central Asia to China, establishing temples, monasteries, and libraries. The diffusion of Buddhism illustrates how ideas can follow the currents of commerce, reaching new territories and adapting to local contexts. Similarly, the spread of Islam from Arabia into Central Asia and eventually into the western reaches of China transformed cultural, social, and economic landscapes. Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians, and Manichaeans all traversed these networks, contributing to a complex mosaic of belief and practice that shaped the identities of countless communities along the way. Art and architecture bear the most visible testimony to this cross-cultural fertilization. Motifs and techniques from Persia influenced Chinese ceramics. Buddhist iconography merged with Hellenistic styles in Central Asia. Textiles produced in one region often carried patterns inspired by another. Even musical traditions and instruments traveled along these routes, blending and evolving as they encountered new audiences. The Silk Road facilitated the circulation of ideas that were as valuable, if not more so, than gold or silk, creating a shared cultural currency that transcended borders. In many ways, it was a precursor to the cultural globalization we recognize today. Economically, the Silk Road was a lifeline for many regions. Cities and states along the route flourished because they could tax trade, provide services for merchants, and foster markets where local and foreign goods could be exchanged. Caravanserais, inns strategically located every 20 to 30 miles, provided shelter, food, and security for merchants and their animals. These way stations were more than resting points. They were hubs of information exchange, places where news, rumors, and knowledge traveled as quickly as merchandise. Banking practices emerged as merchants developed systems of credit, promissory notes, and letters of exchange to facilitate long-distance trade. Such financial innovations reveal an early sophistication in economic systems and a recognition of trust as an essential component of commerce. The dangers of the Silk Road were omnipresent. Desert sands, mountain passes, bandit raids, and political instability all posed serious threats to travelers. Yet, these challenges also fostered resilience and adaptability. Caravans were meticulously organized. Leaders knew the terrain, climate, and socio-political context of every leg of the journey. Merchants often formed alliances with local rulers, paying tribute or entering agreements that guaranteed protection. Such arrangements highlight the interdependence between traders and authorities and how commerce could influence governance and diplomacy. The Silk Road, therefore, was a space where negotiation and negotiation skills were as critical as physical endurance. Silk, in particular, was emblematic of the power of desire to drive innovation and interaction. Chinese silk, in particular, was so coveted that it became a form of currency in some regions. The demand for silk influenced diplomacy, military strategy, and even espionage. Protecting the secrets of silk production was paramount, and Chinese authorities imposed severe penalties on those who attempted to smuggle the knowledge abroad. Yet, despite these efforts, sericulture eventually spread to other regions, illustrating the inevitability of cultural and technological diffusion once an idea proves valuable. The exchange along the Silk Road was not limited to luxury goods. Everyday commodities, including grain, salt, and metals, were traded alongside more exotic items. Local products often gained international fame, as the road allowed regions to specialize in what they produced best, creating a network of interdependent economies. This specialization encouraged efficiency, innovation, and the development of regional expertise. Over time, markets evolved, with local and foreign goods mingling, influencing tastes and generating wealth for both merchants and the states that facilitated trade. Language, too, was a medium of exchange along the Silk Road. Multilingual communities developed in key trading centers, with interpreters and scribes ensuring that contracts, agreements, and knowledge could traverse linguistic boundaries. Writing systems, accounting practices, and commercial records were shared and adapted, creating a sophisticated communication network that supported commerce over thousands of miles. The very existence of these multilingual hubs attests to the necessity of collaboration and understanding in sustaining long-distance trade. The Silk Road's influence even into science and medicine. Astronomical knowledge, medicinal herbs, and surgical techniques traveled alongside textiles and spices. Indian numerals, which evolved into the Arabic numeral system, spread to the west along these routes, transforming mathematics, commerce, and engineering. Paper-making technology, originating in China, traveled westward, enabling the proliferation of texts and the preservation of knowledge. These scientific exchanges illustrate that the Silk Road was not merely a trade route, but a corridor of intellectual advancement, shaping the scientific and technological trajectories of entire civilizations. Political events often reshaped the Silk Road's geography and accessibility. The rise and fall of empires, the expansion of nomadic tribes, and military conquests all influenced which routes were safe and profitable. For example, the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, unified vast territories across Eurasia, providing unprecedented stability and security along trade routes. This period, often referred to as the Pax Mongolica, enabled merchants to travel with relative safety, facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas, and encouraged diplomatic missions between distant powers. The Mongol era illustrates how political unity, even under militaristic regimes, could enhance commercial and cultural connectivity. Yet, the Silk Road was not immune to decline. By the late 15th century, shifts in political power, the fragmentation of empires, and the rise of maritime trade routes contributed to a gradual diminishment of overland commerce. The discovery of sea routes to Asia by European explorers offered safer, faster, and more profitable alternatives, leading to the redirection of global trade flows. Despite this, the legacy of the Silk Road persisted. Cultural, religious, and technological exchanges continued to influence societies long after caravans ceased to traverse the deserts and mountains with regularity. The human stories embedded in the Silk Road are as compelling as the goods transported. Merchants who spent years on the road, often never returning to their homeland, endured extreme hardship yet contributed to the web of connections that shaped civilizations. Travelers like Xuanzang, the Chinese Buddhist monk, undertook arduous journeys to India to retrieve sacred texts, bringing back religious knowledge that would influence generations. Even anonymous merchants, artisans, and guides played roles in this network, their labor and expertise forming the backbone of what would become a defining feature of global history. The Silk Road also nurtured innovation in transportation and logistics. The development of the Bactrian camel, capable of carrying heavy loads across arid landscapes, was pivotal. Saddles, harnesses, and caravan organization evolved to meet the demands of long-distance trade. Water management techniques, route planning, and knowledge of seasonal weather patterns became crucial, and these logistical advancements were shared across regions, contributing to technological progress in areas far beyond their point of origin. Cultural resilience along the Silk Road is also evident in the artistic traditions it preserved and transformed. Manuscripts, murals, textiles, and ceramics all bear witness to a blending of styles and motifs. Techniques from one region were adapted and enriched by local artisans, creating hybrid art forms that embody the cross-cultural dialogue facilitated by trade. Music, dance, and storytelling similarly absorbed diverse influences, demonstrating the dynamic nature of cultural expression along the network. The Silk Road was, in many ways, an incubator of creativity, where exposure to diversity inspired innovation. Religious syncretism was another remarkable outcome. The encounters between Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Christianity, and later Islam created communities that integrated multiple beliefs, practices, and rituals. Temples and shrines often display architectural and artistic elements from multiple traditions, reflecting a lived reality of coexistence and exchange. These spiritual interactions highlight the capacity of trade networks to not only move material goods, but to shape ethical, moral, and philosophical frameworks, influencing how societies understood themselves and their place in the world. Trade along the Silk Road also reshaped social hierarchies and urban life. Cities that served as nodes in this vast network became cosmopolitan centers, populated by merchants, artisans, scholars, and officials from diverse backgrounds. Social mobility, though limited, was possible for those who successfully navigated the economic opportunities offered by trade. A merchant who established reliable networks could amass wealth and influence, sometimes rivaling that of local nobility. At the same time, the demand for skilled labor fostered specialized professions, from translators and accountants to caravan leaders and craftsmen, creating new forms of social organization that were intimately tied to the flows of commerce. Women, too, played roles along the Silk Road, though their contributions are less frequently documented. In some communities, women were active in managing trade enterprises, crafting textiles, and maintaining household economies that supported caravan journeys. Female artisans produced goods that were highly prized along the routes, including silk garments, jewelry, and decorative items. Monastic women also participated in religious and educational activities, transmitting knowledge and influencing local cultures. Their presence demonstrates that the Silk Road was not merely a domain of male merchants and warriors, but a complex social system with diverse contributors. The movement of currency and finance along the Silk Road was an early experiment in economic globalization. Coins from multiple empires circulated alongside barter goods, and exchange rates were negotiated in marketplaces that brought together representatives of distant polities. Financial instruments, such as letters of credit, allowed merchants to conduct transactions safely across vast distances, minimizing the risks of theft or loss. These systems required trust and legal understanding, encouraging the development of standardized contracts and commercial codes. In effect, the Silk Road fostered a proto-global economy where principles of commerce, risk management, and negotiation were continuously refined and transmitted across regions. Medicine and healthcare were also influenced by the Silk Road. Herbal knowledge, medical texts, and surgical techniques traveled with merchants, often along spices and luxury goods. Chinese herbal remedies found their way into Central Asian practices, while Indian medical texts influenced Persian and Arab physicians. The exchange of medical knowledge contributed to the development of hospitals, pharmacies, and therapeutic practices in multiple regions, demonstrating that the Silk Road's impact extended far beyond trade, shaping the health and well-being of societies along its paths. Education and literacy flourished along these routes. Monasteries, madrasas, and libraries served as repositories of knowledge, attracting scholars who traveled to access texts and exchange ideas. Mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, and philosophical treatises were transmitted across continents, influencing curricula and intellectual traditions. The flow of knowledge encouraged critical thinking, debate, and innovation, demonstrating that the Silk Road was as much an intellectual highway as it was a commercial one. Communities that embraced learning gained advantages in governance, technology, and culture, highlighting the interconnectedness of commerce and intellectual advancement. The ecological impact of the Silk Road is another often overlooked aspect. The movement of goods and animals introduced new species to regions far from their origin. Horses from Central Asia transformed warfare and agriculture in China, while crops such as grapes, citrus, and pomegranates spread along trade networks, altering diets and agricultural practices. The introduction of non-native species sometimes had unintended consequences, influencing local ecosystems, economies, and even the spread of disease. These environmental interactions underscore the far-reaching effects of human activity along the Silk Road, illustrating that trade, culture, and ecology are intertwined in complex ways. Political diplomacy and espionage were closely tied to commerce. Empires recognized that controlling trade routes meant controlling wealth and influence. Envoys were dispatched to negotiate treaties, secure safe passage, and gather intelligence on rival powers. In some instances, commercial activity was used as a cover for diplomatic missions or even military reconnaissance. This intersection of trade and politics shows that the Silk Road was a space of strategic importance, where economic interests and statecraft were deeply intertwined, shaping the course of empires and the security of regions far removed from the central powers. Religion, once again, demonstrates the interweaving of spiritual and material exchange. Temples, shrines, and monasteries were often supported by merchant patronage, creating a reciprocal relationship between faith and commerce. Donations from traders not only facilitated religious practice, but also established networks of influence and protection. Monastic institutions sometimes functioned as way stations or safe havens for travelers, bridging spiritual and practical needs. The Silk Road's religious landscape reveals the multiple layers of human activity, where belief systems, economic imperatives, and social organization coexisted and reinforced one another. Cultural fusion along the Silk Road is evident in art, literature, and language. Manuscripts written in multiple scripts illustrate the movement of ideas and the coexistence of linguistic traditions. Decorative motifs combine Persian, Chinese, and Hellenistic influences, reflecting the hybridization of aesthetic sensibilities. Music and performance arts absorbed instruments and styles from distant lands, creating genres that were uniquely adapted to local tastes while retaining elements of their origin. Such fusion demonstrates that human creativity thrives on interaction, and that trade is not merely an economic activity, but a vehicle for cultural enrichment. Technological innovation traveled hand in hand with commerce. Metallurgy, ceramics, navigation techniques, and textile production methods spread along the Silk Road, allowing regions to adopt and adapt practices that improved local production and quality of life. Wind and water management techniques, tools for farming, and methods of construction were transmitted across vast distances, facilitating urban development, agricultural efficiency, and infrastructure expansion. The flow of technology illustrates that human progress has always been linked to the sharing of knowledge, a principle embodied by the Silk Road centuries before modern globalization. The Silk Road also illustrates the limits and vulnerabilities of long-distance networks. Political fragmentation, military campaigns, and the rise of new powers could disrupt trade, causing economic contraction and social upheaval. Natural disasters, including droughts and floods, posed additional challenges. Yet, the resilience of these networks and the ability of communities to adapt to changing circumstances reveals an enduring capacity for innovation and negotiation. Caravans altered routes, cities adjusted marketplaces, and empires modified policies to ensure continuity. The Silk Road's history is thus a story of both fragility and adaptation, showing that commerce depends not only on desire and ambition, but on the human capacity to respond to risk and uncertainty. The psychological impact of the Silk Road is another dimension worth exploring. Exposure to distant cultures, ideas, and practices broadened perspectives, encouraging curiosity and intellectual engagement. Tales of foreign lands sparked imagination and ambition, influencing literature, philosophy, and scientific inquiry. For many, the road was a bridge to a wider world, a space where experiences challenged assumptions and fostered a sense of shared humanity. This intangible legacy, shaping perceptions, values, and knowledge, is as enduring as the material wealth transported along the paths. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, maritime routes began to supplant overland trade in significance. European exploration of the oceans, the establishment of colonial ports, and the emergence of global empires redirected the flow of goods and ideas. Yet, even as the overland Silk Road diminished in prominence, its cultural and intellectual impact persisted. Local markets, religious institutions, and artistic traditions retained influences from centuries of cross-continental interaction. The patterns established by the Silk Road informed subsequent global networks, laying the groundwork for the interconnected world we recognize today. In modern scholarship, the Silk Road is appreciated not merely for the movement of material goods, but for its role as a conduit of human experience. Anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists examine artifacts, texts, and monuments to reconstruct the lives of those who traversed these routes. Each coin, manuscript, and textile fragment tells a story of negotiation, adaptation, and connection. By studying these remnants, we gain insight into the complexity of pre-modern globalization, understanding how individuals and communities navigated the challenges of distance, diversity, and risk. The Silk Road also highlights the interdependence of civilizations. The prosperity of one region often relied on the stability and productivity of another. A drought in Central Asia could disrupt trade reaching China or Persia. Political unrest in Persia could alter markets in the Mediterranean. These interconnections underscore that human societies have always been part of broader networks, dependent on collaboration and communication across borders. In this way, the Silk Road is not merely historical, it is a lens through which to understand the enduring patterns of human interconnection. Beyond commerce and politics, the Silk Road shaped everyday life. Diets were enriched by the introduction of new crops, fashion evolved with imported textiles, and religious practice was informed by distant beliefs. Even entertainment, music, storytelling, and theater was influenced by the cross-cultural interactions facilitated by these routes. The Silk Road reminds us that globalization is not only an economic phenomenon, but a social and cultural one, affecting the texture of daily life and the identity of communities across continents. The lessons of the Silk Road resonate today. As modern trade and communication shrink distances and exchange, the experiences of merchants, travelers, and communities along the ancient routes offer insight into resilience, cooperation, and adaptation. The Silk Road's history encourages reflection on the benefits and challenges of interconnectedness. The Silk Road was not just a conduit of commerce, it was a corridor of diplomacy, negotiation, and cultural diplomacy. Empires recognized that controlling trade meant not only wealth, but also influence. Envoys and ambassadors traveled the routes, carrying messages, gifts, and alliances. The careful orchestration of these journeys often determined the stability of entire regions. Agreements between states, forged through negotiation with merchants and local authorities, ensured that trade could continue even amidst political turbulence. In this way, the Silk Road operated as a dynamic arena where diplomacy and commerce were inseparable, with each influencing the other in profound ways. Literature and storytelling flourished along the Silk Road. Merchants, travelers, and scholars carried tales of distant lands, mythical creatures, heroic deeds, and divine interventions. These narratives were often adapted to local audiences, blending indigenous motifs with exotic elements. The result was a rich corpus of oral and written literature that transcended borders. Epic poems, folktales, and religious texts spread far beyond their place of origin, creating a shared literary culture across Eurasia. In some regions, these stories shaped social norms, ethics, and cultural memory, reflecting the deep interconnection between narrative and human experience along the trade routes. Artisans benefited enormously from Silk Road trade, adapting techniques and designs from different cultures to satisfy the tastes of diverse clientele. Ceramics from China found their way to Persia and beyond, influencing local pottery styles. Textiles incorporated motifs from multiple traditions, combining Persian geometric patterns with Chinese floral designs. Jewelry designs merged gemstones and metalwork from India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. This cross-pollination of artistic styles illustrates how commerce functioned as a medium of cultural exchange, with economic activity directly shaping aesthetic development and innovation. Education and intellectual pursuits were deeply influenced by these exchanges. Monasteries, libraries, and learning centers became hubs of cross-cultural scholarship, where texts from different civilizations were studied, translated, and preserved. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were shared and refined across borders, contributing to scientific advancement. For instance, knowledge of algebra traveled from India to the Middle East and eventually Europe, facilitated by the networks of the Silk Road. Similarly, astronomical techniques, papermaking, and navigational tools were disseminated across the continent, demonstrating that trade and intellectual growth were mutually reinforcing. Religious institutions along the Silk Road not only facilitated spiritual life but also practical commerce. Monasteries offered lodging, food, and security to traveling merchants, creating symbiotic relationships between religion and trade. Temples and shrines were supported financially by merchants who sought blessings for prosperity, safety, and successful transactions. Religious festivals often coincided with market days, bringing communities together and encouraging economic activity. This interplay of spirituality and commerce underscores the multifaceted role of the Silk Road in shaping both material and immaterial aspects of life. The Silk Road was also a vector for technological diffusion. Innovations in metallurgy, agricultural tools, textiles, and transportation were exchanged alongside goods. Camel saddles, wheeled carts, water-lifting devices, and irrigation techniques spread along the routes, transforming local economies and production methods. These technological transfers illustrate how trade networks served as conduits not only for tangible items, but for ideas that enhanced productivity, efficiency, and human capability. The cumulative effect of these exchanges was the gradual improvement of livelihoods across multiple regions, creating a foundation for sustained economic development. Economic systems evolved in response to the demands of long-distance trade. Marketplaces became sophisticated centers of negotiation, featuring weighing scales, standardized measures, and currency exchange facilities. Local governments established regulations, taxation, and security measures to facilitate commerce while asserting authority. Guilds and merchant associations emerged, regulating quality, prices, and trade practices. Financial instruments such as bills of exchange and promissory notes minimized risks for merchants traveling thousands of miles. Together, these structures reveal a remarkable level of economic sophistication, demonstrating that the Silk Road was not merely a series of trade routes, but an integrated system of commerce with its own rules, norms, and institutions. Geography shaped the rhythm of the Silk Road. Mountain passes, deserts, rivers, and plains dictated the flow of caravans. Seasonal considerations, such as snow in high altitudes or monsoon winds along maritime extensions, required careful planning. The distribution of water sources, pasture for animals, and safe resting points influenced settlement patterns, city development, and the rise of caravanserai. Geography thus exerted a profound influence on economic and social organization, shaping the decisions of both travelers and the empires that sought to control the routes. Conflict and war also impacted the Silk Road, sometimes interrupting commerce but also prompting adaptation. Raiders and bandits threatened travelers, requiring coordination, defense mechanisms, and intelligence networks. Political instability could close routes, redirect trade, or prompt the rise of new markets. Yet these challenges also spurred innovation. Merchants developed alternative paths, negotiated treaties with local powers, and diversified goods to mitigate risk. The Silk Road illustrates how human enterprise can persist and adapt in the face of adversity, balancing opportunity with danger. The health of populations along the Silk Road was influenced by the movement of people and goods. While trade facilitated the spread of medicinal knowledge and remedies, it also enabled the transmission of diseases. Epidemics traveled with caravans, affecting societies across continents. These challenges required adaptive strategies,
Quarantine measures, health advisories, and travel regulations emerged in response to outbreaks. The Silk Road thus exemplifies the dual nature of connectivity, bringing both enrichment and vulnerability. Understanding these dynamics offers insight into how interconnected networks manage risk, a lesson still relevant in today's globalized world. Cultural syncretism is one of the most enduring legacies of the Silk Road. Artistic, religious, and philosophical traditions blended, producing hybrid forms that were unique to particular regions yet bore influences from distant lands. Architecture, music, literature, and visual arts reflect layers of cultural interaction, adaptation, and reinterpretation. These syncretic forms demonstrate that the Silk Road was not merely a conduit for imitation, but a space of creativity where exposure to diversity inspired innovation and new forms of expression. The impact of the Silk Road on local economies was profound. Small towns evolved into bustling trade centers, benefiting from the influx of merchants and goods. Local artisans gained access to new materials and techniques, enhancing production and expanding markets. Wealth generated through trade supported infrastructure, public works, and cultural institutions. At the same time, trade networks created dependencies. Regions specialized in specific products or services, linking their prosperity to broader market dynamics. This interdependence illustrates the early emergence of economic globalization, long before the modern era. Maritime extensions of the Silk Road further amplified its reach. Ports along the Indian Ocean, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf connected with inland routes, facilitating the flow of spices, textiles, and precious metals. Monsoon winds dictated the rhythm of travel, creating predictable patterns that merchants relied upon for scheduling shipments. Coastal cities flourished as hubs of exchange, blending cultures from Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. The integration of sea and land routes illustrates the adaptability of trade networks and the capacity of human societies to exploit environmental opportunities for economic gain. The Silk Road also served as a vector of intellectual curiosity and scientific exploration. Scholars and inventors traveled to study distant techniques, compare methodologies, and test theories. Observations in astronomy, mathematics, physiology, and agriculture were shared across continents, enriching knowledge systems. Texts were copied, translated, and disseminated, creating a repository of human thought accessible to diverse cultures. The intellectual vitality generated along the Silk Road underscores the interdependence of commerce and education, revealing that economic exchange can serve as a catalyst for knowledge production and innovation. By the late medieval period, the Silk Road's influence extended even further. The rise of the Mongol Empire unified vast stretches of territory, facilitating travel, reducing barriers, and ensuring security along major routes. During this period, cultural and commercial exchange intensified, with goods, ideas, and people moving more freely than at almost any previous point in history. The Pax Mongolica exemplifies the ways in which political cohesion can amplify the benefits of trade, fostering prosperity, stability, and cross-cultural understanding. Yet, even during periods of stability, the Silk Road remained a space of negotiation, adaptation, and risk management. Merchants had to navigate local politics, variable terrain, and cultural differences. Contracts were drafted, alliances formed, and disputes resolved with careful diplomacy. This required not only practical knowledge of goods and routes, but emotional intelligence and strategic thinking. In this sense, the Silk Road was a training ground for skills that transcend commerce, cultivating negotiation, cultural literacy, and problem-solving abilities that remain relevant today.
As the early modern era approached, the Silk Road faced new challenges. The rise of maritime trade, propelled by European exploration and the discovery of sea routes to Asia, shifted the centers of commerce away from overland pathways. Ships could carry larger cargoes more quickly and with fewer of the hazards associated with deserts, mountains, and bandits. While the overland Silk Road declined in relative economic significance, it did not vanish entirely. Local and regional trade persisted, and the cultural, intellectual, and religious legacies embedded along these routes continued to shape societies. The decline of the Silk Road also underscores the impermanence of human systems. Political fragmentation, warfare, and shifting alliances disrupted traditional trade patterns. Cities that once thrived as commercial hubs contracted, while others adapted to new forms of economic activity. Caravanserais fell into disuse, and ancient pathways became overgrown or repurposed. Yet even in decline, the impact of the Silk Road endured, leaving an indelible mark on architecture, urban planning, cuisine, and artistic traditions. Modern cities along the former routes still reflect the layered influence of centuries of commerce, exchange, and cultural synthesis. One of the most profound legacies of the Silk Road is its demonstration of human interconnectedness. Goods, ideas, beliefs, and technologies moved in a dynamic, multi-directional flow. A textile crafted in China might end up adorning a noble in Byzantium. A philosophical concept from India could influence a scholar in Central Asia. A medicinal herb discovered in Persia might shape healthcare practices in China. This interdependence illustrates that human progress has always relied on exchange, collaboration, and mutual curiosity. In many ways, the Silk Road can be seen as an early blueprint for globalization, revealing both its opportunities and its vulnerabilities. The Silk Road also exemplifies the resilience of human culture. Languages evolved through contact, creating multilingual communities capable of navigating complex social and commercial networks. Artistic traditions merged and adapted, producing works that were both innovative and reflective of diverse influences. Religious and philosophical ideas intertwined, fostering communities capable of coexistence and dialogue despite vast cultural differences. This resilience is a reminder that cultural vitality often emerges from contact, exchange, and adaptation rather than isolation. The stories of individuals along the Silk Road illustrate the human dimension of this vast network. Merchants, artisans, scholars, pilgrims, and diplomats each contributed to the tapestry of exchange. A merchant risking his caravan through the Taklamakan Desert carried not only goods but also ideas, news, and cultural practices. A monk journeying to distant lands to collect sacred texts preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. A translator interpreting contracts or religious texts bridged gaps between civilizations. These acts, often unnoticed in broader historical narratives, collectively sustained one of the most remarkable networks in human history. Innovation along the Silk Road was not confined to material goods. Knowledge of finance, accounting, law, and logistics evolved in response to the challenges of long-distance trade. Letters of credit, standardized weights and measures, and risk management practices allowed merchants to operate across vast distances with relative confidence. These innovations spread along the trade routes, influencing legal systems, economic thought, and administrative practices in diverse regions. In essence, the Silk Road served as an incubator for systems and practices that would underpin later developments in global commerce. One of the most profound legacies of the Silk Road is its demonstration of human interconnectedness. Goods, ideas, beliefs, and technologies moved in a dynamic, multi-directional flow. A textile crafted in China might end up adorning a noble in Byzantium. A philosophical concept from India could influence a scholar in Central Asia. A medicinal herb discovered in Persia might shape healthcare practices in China. This interdependence illustrates that human progress has always relied on exchange, collaboration, and mutual curiosity. In many ways, the Silk Road can be seen as an early blueprint for globalization, revealing both its opportunities and its vulnerabilities. The Silk Road also exemplifies the resilience of human culture. Languages evolved through contact, creating multilingual communities capable of navigating complex social and commercial networks. Artistic traditions merged and adapted, producing works that were both innovative and reflective of diverse influences. Religious and philosophical ideas intertwined, fostering communities capable of coexistence and dialogue despite vast cultural differences. This resilience is a reminder that cultural vitality often emerges from contact, exchange, and adaptation rather than isolation. The stories of individuals along the Silk Road illustrate the human dimension of this vast network. Merchants, artisans, scholars, pilgrims, and diplomats each contributed to the tapestry of exchange.
A merchant risking his caravan through the Taklamakan Desert carried not only goods, but ideas, news, and cultural practices. A monk journeying to distant lands to collect sacred texts preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. A translator interpreting contracts or religious texts bridged gaps between civilizations. These acts, often unnoticed in broader historical narratives, collectively sustained one of the most remarkable networks in human history. Innovation along the Silk Road was not confined to material goods. Knowledge of finance, accounting, law, and logistics evolved in response to the challenges of long-distance trade. Letters of credit, standardized weights and measures, and risk management practices allowed merchants to operate across vast distances with relative confidence. These innovations spread along the trade routes, influencing legal systems, economic thought, and administrative practices in diverse regions. In effect, the Silk Road served as an incubator for systems and practices that would underpin later developments in global commerce. Religious and philosophical thought also benefited from the Silk Road. Ideas traveled alongside goods, shaping moral codes, social norms, and intellectual frameworks. Philosophy, science, and medicine all benefited from this circulation of knowledge, demonstrating that the movement of ideas was as vital as the movement of goods in shaping human history. The Silk Road's environmental impact is another aspect of its legacy. The movement of animals, plants, and agricultural practices reshaped ecosystems, diets, and economies. Horses transformed transportation and military strategy, while crops introduced from one region to another diversified diets and agricultural productivity. The environmental consequences of these exchanges were complex, illustrating how human networks influence not only societies but also the natural world. Understanding these dynamics offers insight into the long-term relationship between commerce, culture, and ecology. Security and governance were critical components of the Silk Road's functionality. Empires invested in roads, way stations, garrisons, and treaties to ensure the safety of merchants and travelers. Local rulers negotiated arrangements to facilitate trade, balancing taxation with protection. Banditry and political instability remained persistent threats, requiring vigilance, adaptability, and cooperation between states and communities. These governance practices reveal an early understanding of infrastructure, public goods, and the interconnectedness of political stability and economic prosperity. One of the Silk Road's decline did not erase its influence. Coastal maritime routes, the rise of European colonial empires, and new political realities transformed global trade. But the patterns established over centuries continued to shape economic, cultural, and social systems. Artistic styles, religious practices, linguistic borrowings, culinary traditions, and scientific knowledge bear traces of Silk Road interactions. Even today, the echoes of these exchanges can be observed in diverse societies across Eurasia, attesting to the enduring power of human networks. Historians and archaeologists have increasingly recognized the Silk Road as more than a historical curiosity. It is a paradigm for understanding the complexity of human societies. The interactions facilitated by these routes illustrate the interdependence of economics, culture, politics, and environment. By studying the Silk Road, we gain insight into how societies adapt to challenges, embrace innovation, and maintain connections over vast distances. The lessons of resilience, adaptation, and cooperation remain relevant, providing a framework for understanding the opportunities and risks of contemporary globalization. Modern initiatives, such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, consciously evoke the spirit of the Silk Road, seeking to revitalize trade routes and foster economic and cultural exchange across Eurasia. While the context and scale differ, these contemporary efforts highlight the enduring fascination with the principles embodied by the ancient network: connectivity, exchange, and mutual benefit. The Silk Road remains a potent symbol, reminding us of the potential for human collaboration across culture, geographical, and temporal boundaries. The human dimension of the Silk Road cannot be overstated. Individuals, whether merchants, scholars, monks, or artisans, drove the networks of exchange. Their stories, often embedded in fragments of letters, artifacts, and texts, reveal lives defined by courage, curiosity, and perseverance. The risks they undertook, the innovations they pioneered, and the cultural bridges they built collectively shaped the trajectory of human civilization. Even in decline, the Silk Road